welcome to you all. Thank you for joining the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council's program featuring Professor Sylvia Wasteboard. My name is Ted Powers. I'm an ICFRC board member and your host for today's program. Today is the 7th program in our spring 2026 lineup. As a reminder, we planned for this program to go until 7:30 p.m., beginning with our speakers' remarks and then a Q&A period. We're deeply grateful for the long-standing support from our community, ensuring that we can provide quality programming on international issues for over 42 years. We couldn't be here without you. Thank you. We hope that everyone here will consider making a donation. I want to tell you about our next program. Please plan on joining us on Thursday, April 16th, here in Iowa City Public Library for Worker Resilience, from South Africa's mines to Iowa's farms, fields, and meatpacking plants. What can Iowa learn from the struggles of mine workers in South Africa? This panel discussion connects the global story of dust, disease, and dignity to the realities of Iowa fields, factories, and immigrant workforce. Through powerful parallels, it highlights how protecting vulnerable workers is not only a matter of health, but also of justice and resilience. Understanding the nexus between work and community and the commonalities between people here and in South Africa is one important step in the global effort of finding solutions to ease the too often invisible burden shouldered by vulnerable and working populations. Don't delay in registering for our upcoming programs, particularly our last of the season and our final program in our Resisting Global Tyranny series. For the first time, the ICFRC will be at the Engler. More information about The Blind Spot, How Oligarchs Dominate Our Democracy, on Thursday, May 7th is on your tables and on our website. With that, let's turn to today's program. ICFRC would like to give a heartfelt thank you to our partners, the Iowa City Public Library and the UI School of Journalism and Mass Communication, who provided the food for today. And before we begin, we'll be briefly turning over to Board Member Rick Dobbins for brief comments before I turn over to Professor Gigi Durham to introduce our esteemed speaker for today. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Rick. I'm with TED. As he said, we're going to do a new project that we haven't done before after the presentation and after you have the Q&A with Silvio. I'll be back to kind of discuss it, but if you have about 20 minutes before you leave, if you could stick around and help our council with something, please do so. I'll be right back to discuss that with you when we're all done. Thanks.
In a recent article, one of over 50 that he has published, Professor Sylvia Wasteboard defined democratic communication as, quote, institutional conditions and practices anchored in the principles of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to communication, tolerance and solidarity, fact-based reasoning, and truth-searching. As he has also noted in his wide-ranging and penetrating analyses of global political systems, these principles are in trouble. I'm Meenakshi Gigi Durham, professor in the UI School of Journalism and Mass Communication, and in partnership with the ICFRC, we are delighted to welcome Professor Wasteboard here tonight to share his expertise on this issue, the role of journalism in a time of crisis for democracies. I think many of us share the hope and fears, or maybe I should say the fears and hope, that he references in the title of his talk today. Our distinguished speaker, Sylvia Wasteboard, is professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. He is president and fellow of the International Communication Association. He is editor of the International Journal of Communication. He is the author and editor of 20 books, as well as articles, essays, and chapters on journalism and politics, communication studies, media policy, and communication for social change. His most recent book is Introduction to Journalism, Thinking Globally, published by Polity. He served as director of the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University from 2020 to 2023. He is the former editor-in-chief of the Journal of Communication and the International Journal of Press Politics. Dr. Wasteboard received a licenciatura in sociology from Universidad de Buenos Aires and a PhD in sociology from the University of California, San Diego. Dr. Wasteboard is visiting Iowa City as the UI School of Journalism and Mass Communication's 2026 McGranahan Lecturer, and I'm happy to present him with a small token to commemorate this and to thank him for speaking to us tonight.
Good evening. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you to the school and to the council for the opportunity to share with you some ideas about this topic. And also for the hospitality and for everything that you have done to make it possible for me to be here for the last almost 2 days. I had great conversations with many of you, and I look forward to this conversation as well. So let me tell you why I'm talking about this topic. Hope and fears, why journalism remains essential in a time of global democratic erosion. There are basically two reasons. I've been teaching for a long time classes on introduction to journalism and international journalism. And in class discussion, frequently we discuss why and how journalism matters. And many students sort of find interest in the question if journalism is still essential. And this is part of sort of the changes in the way that people consume information, people consume or don't consume news. And a question that frequently comes up from them is, why have a career in journalism, given everything that has been happening in this country and around the world? Students, because of their passion for journalism, they understand that journalism matters. And they understand that journalism can do much for democracy and for public life. Yet they ask the question whether journalism is relevant in the current context of changes in the information communication landscape, AI, social media, post-truth conditions, fragmentation, and polarization. In fact, last week, I get these questions regularly. Last week, I got an email from one student saying the following: how do you personally stay optimistic about journalism? Your class has fostered a lot of conversations and learning about the challenges to journalism. We are towards the end of the semester, so they heard my spiel on this. And it can sometimes feel all-consuming and doomy. I would love to learn more about your ideas on this. There you go. You ask students to be critical and curious, and then you get this kind of questions. So in some ways, what I'm going to talk about is sort of a very long-winded response to this student. And a second reason to talk about this topic is the current state of the situation of quality reporting. It is a time of great journalism, actually. Journalism that is committed to creative, critical reporting, engaging, thought-provoking storytelling. Yet, probably much of this valuable work goes unnoticed amid the digital noise, content abundance, everything else. So we are facing a situation in which excellent journalism may not find the audience that it deserves, given algorithm dynamics, and the fact that the conditions under which people encounter most content or share content is dominated by tech corporations who have no concern for actual journalism. And in fact, we are confronted in this situation in which efforts to strengthen and diversify quality news may not translate into more diverse news experiences, reach, and visibility because of the conditions in which we are living. So today, my interest is to call attention to the relevance of journalism. How do we understand the communicative, social, and political relevance of journalism at a time of democratic erosion and illiberalism? We may believe that journalism matters for democracy and society for good reasons, and I assume many of us here do believe that. But the question is that it's not immediately obvious that whether and how journalism is actually relevant. By presenting this, I hope not only to respond to students' concerns and anxiety about careers in journalism or the state of journalism, but also to figure out how do we determine why journalism effectively matters. So let me start with this. Recently, there have been a number of worried and sort of despondent views among scholars and journalists about exactly this point, about whether or not journalism is still relevant. Let me give you some examples from scholars and then a few quotes from US journalists. In their book, Matt Carlson, Sue Robinson, and Seth Lewis conveyed this sentiment about doubting whether or not journalism is relevant. This is their 2021 book, prematurely, or some people might call it optimistically called, News After Trump. Journalism Crisis of Relevance in a Changed Media Culture, right? How much things have changed since then, one could argue, or probably haven't changed much. That's one example. Another example is in early 2025, in the annual rounds of predictions about journalism in the news industry published by the Nieman Lab, media scholar Alice Marwick writes, the mainstream media would lose its last grip on relevancy, and the fundamental gap in understanding between partisan Americans will widen. She says, the 2024 election showed just how irrelevant mainstream news coverage is outside the Beltway and the chattering class. And she continues with other examples around this. Third example from a scholar, Rasmus Nielsen, in an article published in Prospect last year. The headline is this ominous headline about irrelevant, and I love how the press lost its touch. Journalism is in a free fall, and the public doesn't care. Sort of, in some ways, along the same lines of the sentiment expressed by the other quotes. Kyle Pope was the editor of the Columbia Journalism Review until a few years ago. And in his farewell editorial, he says the following. The project of journalism in America is as unsettled as ever. And the core problem is the same one we flagged in 2019. How do you go about doing your work in the face of an audience that often seems not to care? It resonates with the language that many scholars have used. How do you measure journalism that is not having the impact you want or expect? It's easy to be demoralized. Stories one will hope would land with a jolt often simmer instead. And his answer is a hopeful answer. Our only answer is to keep doing what we are doing, focusing less on the results of our work and more on the importance of telling the truth to our audience. So, in my mind, these reflections express concerns about journalism relevance and the future. And if these are despondent views, then we have much more apocalyptic views about sort of the future of the news industry and journalism. And this is published by journalists, not by the enemies of journalism. Make that point clear. So here's my question for the conversation. How do we determine that journalism is still essential and relevant? Is this particularly a U.S. problem, a U.S. concern? Are there similar concerns elsewhere? What can we learn from global experiences about the relevance of journalism in contemporary politics and society? There is no doubt that there are signs of journalism diminished relevance. Let's put it this way. Proportion of people who get news online in last week continues to decline, according to information from the Reuters Institute at Oxford University. That is one of the prime sources of this kind of information. They've been tracking this for quite some time. Also, there are significant age difference in news consumption, in news use. Right, you can see this clearly. Third, there is an increase in social media as a source of news across a variety of countries, and of course, this also depends on age. But we find similar developments. Again, all this data comes from the Reuters Institute. What else is worrisome? Here I have a situation of the declining search traffic. Web traffic, let me tell you the US statistics, for the top 100 newspapers has dropped 45% over the past 4 years. This information from 2025. The phenomenon of zero-click doesn't bode well for journalism relevance. Recent reports basically show the dramatic decline in news traffic in the past year, right? So there are a number of examples that actually are showing sort of this simultaneous decline, sudden drop, particularly because of the rise of AI as a way to replace the way that people search and find information, news online, right? This is some of the sort of other data that proves the point. Then there is the rising popularity of influencers, right? Content creators and streamers that's, which actually reflect, and in some cases, according to recent studies, public preference for non-journalistic sources to actually get news, to actually get information. And the fact that many news organizations have tried to adopt some sort of ideas, insights from influencers in order to deliver, in order to convey content, actually shows the realization that there is an important challenge. Forward. And lastly, the phenomenon of news avoidance, which is increasingly people avoid news for a variety of reasons. And many journalism scholars are trying to figure out exactly what are the reasons why people increasingly tend to avoid news. One of the arguments that people don't feel that they need or believe that they need or that they trust journalism. So there's sort of several factors that explains news avoidance in many countries around the world. And here is my question. If journalism is losing relevance, as everything that I presented so far seems to suggest, why is it that autocrats fear, demonize, and persecute journalism? Are they not reading the numbers? Are they not reading the data? Don't they receive the Reuters report saying journalism is weighed out, is fading out? Why bother so much to do this? What drives the contemporary global politics of censorship? From official trackers of a press performance that a certain government palace has instituted, to actual fake news laws, right? What explains the obsession with controlling journalism if supposedly journalism is irrelevant? How to explain the politics of media clientelism and media capture that are common around the world? Media clientelism basically deals between governments and wealthy owners, media oligarchs, as well as media capture, in which sort of media policies are captured by primarily private interests, large corporations, right? So then the question is, and I can give you other examples. Why do governments and the military restrict journalistic access to war zones and to victims? Why do they engage in heavy-handed press management operations? Why do police forces rough up and monitor, survey journalists and citizen reporters, right? So here there is sort of something that doesn't sit quite well, which is what I presented earlier. And if you look at around the world, what has been happening? In fact, what has been happening for the past years is a significant decline in global press freedom. And the number of press freedom organizations around the world have documented this development extremely well. And this is from Reporters Without Borders, the map from last year. And then the question becomes, what is driving? The sort of common reasons why. What explained this across the board, across the world, decline in press freedom? This comes from Reporters Without Borders and shows sort of different levels of rolling back press freedoms in different regions around the world. You get the picture. What is it about? And I think that here what is happening is that there's no coincidence that we are monitoring, that we are finding these patterns at the same time that we are sort of understanding the rise of illiberalism or far-right populism. Why? Because clearly these kind of movements and in governments in some cases are hell-bent on erasing journalism, right? They assume that journalism is relevant, and what they try to do is to basically conduct multifaceted assaults on journalism. They get very creative about this. They use legal means, economic means, violence, psychological violence, etc., in order to cow journalism, critical journalism, into silence. And what seems to be happening there is that the conviction among illiberal forces that a small opening to information that disputes, that counters official versions, may be followed by a torrent of criticism and activism. So, in order to answer the question, what we need to do is to determine what relevance is, which is one of the key concepts that I find useful to to address this question. Relevance is a principle of reality construction. Relevance is about knowing and experiencing objects and events. Relevance refers to the social matrix of attention. How institutions, for example, attract, aggregate, and synchronize attention. This is a communicative process, right? How you sort of try to get public engagement, public influence, and activation. That's what relevance refers to. It is about how institutions build attention and all these other aspects. And finally, relevance is relational and social. It's the ability to construct relationships. It's how how certain situations, institutions, and practices become salient or become part of the background that can be practically ignored. So here's my argument. Given multiple forms of journalism and publics today, we cannot understand the relevance of journalism only based on conventional metrics, which have become the lingua franca in the news industry, and of course coming out of the tech industry as the language that speaks volumes in terms of what matters. What is relevant is dictated by data, ignoring the fact that sort of there are multiple ways of interpreting, constructing data, et cetera. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that even by conventional metrics, the question of the relevance of journalism is more complex than what sort of absolute numbers seems to suggest. I will explain this. Metrics, of course, tell us something important, but they don't tell us the full story about the political and the social relevance of journalism. Metrics is the language that matches the commercial logic and the expectations of big tech. This is exactly, for example, the argument that Jeff Bezos, Washington Post owner and owner of pretty much everything else, basically said when he made the decision to lay off a third of the workforce of the Washington Post. He said, I'm quoting here, "The data tells us what is valuable and where to focus." One could make the argument that actually that was not the real decision or the real reason for the decision, but the justification was about the data speaks volume, and there were sort of parts of the Washington Post that were quote unquote underperforming in terms of audience traffic, and therefore that was the decision. Metrics don't capture the full epistemic and social dimensions of relevance, as I hope to show today. So what we need to do is that to think differently about this. We need to think about sort of the relevance of journalism in terms of attention regimes, in plural rather than singular, that shape exactly what relevance is about: visibility, reach, engagement, trust, and influence. The overall context that I'm sort of that I'm placing my reflections here is the dynamics of post-truth and democratic erosion. I will not go into explaining these two concepts. Happy to do that during the conversation. But let me tell you just three factors that explain why journalism is confronting the challenges that is confronting. The first one is platform communication, something that in communication media studies we have, we continue to pay close attention. Sort of, we live in a platform society, or so the argument goes. Basically, what is the challenge here? The challenge here is that it's harder for journalism to compete for public attention in comparison to other institutions or to other content. We can say that journalism has a dwindling ability to organize and to classify social experiences compared to the power it had as a major news gatekeeper and to command public attention as it was during the 20th century, right? This is much more difficult amid information abundance and chaos in the digital society, especially given that big tech defines the rules of attention and engagement and participation, at least in the digital public sphere. This has been said numerous times, but is worth repeating, that these big tech platforms organize social experience in ways that are completely detached from any interest in cultivating or preserving essential aspects of the democratic contract and the conditions. The sole goal is basically to maximize audience and profits through audience engagement, right? Platform communication has no interest, no concerns for the essential values of quality journalism, stories of public relevance, facts, information, truth-telling, and so on. This is the structure that we can define as the faulty scaffolding of the digital public sphere, because it functions in ways that is unrelated to democracy and the public interest. This has been demonstrated numerous times for the last 2 decades, particularly. The reduced visibility of news, the de-amplification of original journalistic content made by the platforms, the fact that the platforms are swamped with non-journalistic content, and many other examples. Second, the second challenge to what we're discussing here about journalism relevance is the contested condition of institutional reputation, trust, and reputation. Let me suggest this. What has been happening to journalism in terms of declining levels of trust, right? Not only in this country, but worldwide, is comparable to what affects other forms of institutional expertise and knowledge, such as science, universities, government agencies that produce original knowledge, and NGOs with a similar mission. The situation of contested expertise is demonstrated more clearly by recurrent controversies in which elites and publics contest, challenge the legitimacy, the findings, the conclusion made by knowledge institutions on certain topics. There's this very interesting book called Controversy Mapping, a field guide across that studies controversy around climate, health, and migration that actually show very similar patterns, in which a combination of political elites typically and publics challenge without much proof or much authority, sort of long-standing findings, conclusions, arguments made by experts. And also the fact that this is related to certain issues, scientific issues or political issues, that activate potential feelings and conflicts and strong sentiments against institutional expertise. So this is the context in which I think we need to place this, what has been happening to journalism. It's not unique to journalism, it's something broader, right? So this situation is not what some people have rushed to call the death or the crisis of expertise. It's a different set of a problem. And I understand that there are some interesting differences across countries and across issues as well. But the point that I want trying to make here is that expertise or trust in expertise is not only tied to credentials or to the classic position of expert institutions, but is grounded in social process that shape reputation, believability, trust, and political identities. And let me explain this further. There are two processes that explain sort of why these developments happen in many places. One is the breakdown of the hierarchical model of information transmission in high-choice information environments like the one we live in. And second is the belief that the news media and other knowledge-producing institutions do not reflect personal or group concerns, right? They don't match specific identities that are mobilized by political entrepreneurs. The situation of journalism is comparable to what two communication scholars, Van der Meer and Hamlers, argue about the fact that science operates in a fragile and increasingly hostile trust environment, right? And finally is the rise of populism, because populism, basically, one of the key aspects is that it shapes and actively mobilizes anti-institutional knowledge campaigns to damage the reputation and the authority of institutional expertise, including journalism. This is the ideological work of an eclectic army of actors: demagogues, merchants of doubt, skeptics, deniers, propaganda entrepreneurs, conspiracy thinkers. They're not really theorists. They're conspiracy thinkers, alternative media, and so on. And this is what we find in many countries around the world. Basically, anti-press campaigns and anti-institutional knowledge campaigns to delegitimize news authority and to activate skeptical or cynical sentiments about the press and other actors. So, in summary, the conditions that I just described partially explain what Wells and Friedland a few years ago called the recognition crisis of journalism, which is the partial denial or the lack of recognition of journalism's importance, journalism's value and trust and contributions to the public good. And the recognition is directly intrinsic to relevance, right? Because attention is the linchpin between these two aspects. Okay, so why do you say put hope in your title, Silvio? Good question. I go here now. Okay, let me tell you ways in which we can make the argument much more complex, while we recognize the anxieties that I put in the first slides among journalists and scholars. So let me show you 6 arguments about why this, how to understand how the story about journalism relevance is a bit more nuanced than the story presented at the very beginning. First of all, globally, the news industry is highly unequal. We cannot talk about journalism in singular anymore, probably if ever that category really captured what journalism was. The news industry globally includes various forms of journalism and news organizations with very different visions, models, practices, funding models, political allegiances, so on and so forth, right? This is just one graphic that I saw there capturing this diversity, and it's, of course, is an incomplete sample of this. So it's not clear what journalism are we talking about that is no longer relevant or it become less relevant. Significant amount of data shows that legacy companies such as the BBC, New York Times, CNN, Daily Mail, the Times of India, The Guardian, Fox News, Le Monde, El País, Al Jazeera, and many other news organizations, think about the countries that you know better around the world, think about this sort of still important news organizations that command national and global audiences in many ways, right? I can give you some numbers about the BBC receives more than 1 billion visits, the New York Times 636 million. You get a sense of what I'm trying to do here. That even if we look at metrics as audience visits, not just members, but audience visits, it's not clear that the picture basically matches that. Recent research in Europe, for example, continues to show the importance of public broadcasting. And much of the research by the Reuters Institute actually shows public broadcasting in many European countries still commands significant attention from audiences throughout the countries and actually across the political divides. So the number of sort of studies that actually seem to suggest that it's too soon, it's premature to actually say that journalism is not relevant, because once you break it down, you find very different situations. This data comes from Eurobarometer from a few years ago, looking at sort of news uses. Yes, you will find the age differences that are sort of appear constantly in this kind of research, but in some ways provide sort of an indication that the situation is a bit much more complex than concluding that journalism is not relevant or has lost sort of its significance. Let me give you another way to understand this: the public and political relevance of some news organizations. The question here is, can we understand contemporary politics without the relevance of some forms of journalism, or more specifically, some news companies? Let me give you some examples of places that I know slightly better. We cannot comprehend critical aspects of Brazilian-mediated politics, from political scandals to the right of far-right populism, without considering the role of major legacy news companies such as Globo, Folha de São Paulo, and TV Record. Also, in the case of Argentine-mediated politics, we cannot understand political developments without considering the role of legacy news organizations, and especially their cable news operations in terms of agenda setting and influence and visibility, as recent studies continue to show. Same thing goes for explaining the rise of the far right in European countries and the role of legacy and digital online news in fostering views aligned clearly, openly with far right positions. You get a sense that if we continue, there are sort of examples that actually say it is about the particular relevance of certain news organizations around specific political subjects. Another way of looking at this question is about the importance of niche media, and much has been written on this. And niche media in a broad sense. Clearly, niche media have been instrumental actors in media and political polarization in many democracies. You can't understand the political polarization without understanding the editorial position, the business model, and all kinds of other aspects of certain news organizations. In fractured polarized media ecologies, polarized media are attention magnets. They don't necessarily sort of attract large numbers of people, but sufficient numbers of people to be influential forces. In some cases, we can argue that attention markets reward news companies that are interested in fragmenting publics and selecting and curating content for specific audiences that are amenable to that content, right? But there's another way of understanding niche media, which is, for example, in terms of geography, local media. Recent studies continue to show the demand and the significance of local media in many countries around the world. Happy to provide some examples later on. And the importance of issue-focused news. So, for example, some recent research on environmental journalism talks about the importance of scale and building an audience that is interested, receptive to certain kind of content. So this kind of phenomena sort of fly under the radar when we're just looking at sort of big numbers, just as metrics. Right? Then, another thing that actually requires much more study from media and journalism scholars is the relevance of news organizations during high-impact news events. What do I mean by this? Think about what happens in situations of breaking news related to big news events, such as the start or the restart of wars, major scandals, celebrity news, elections, popular sports, natural calamities, human-made disasters, and so on. What we have, at least as reported by news organizations, by the industry, is a spike in interest. Spike that lasts for a few days and then it goes back to sort of average levels. These are sort of a new version of classic media events in which people seem to congregate to reach out to legacy and digital news media when there is a surging public interest and that is manifested in sudden audience traffic in news websites. Another example. News in hybrid platformism. This sounds like a mouthful, but actually it's the title of a recent article about Thailand that actually finds what similar studies in other countries have found. That when you look at sort of the amplification of news content, you're thinking about multiple actors that are doing that. That is basically not just legacy and digital news organizations, but also politicians, activists, NGOs, depending on what the issue is. The point that the article makes is called, I can give you the full reference, actually published in IJRC, so that's what is fresh in my mind, in the journal that I edit, that the argument here is that journalism is still relevant in conjunction with other actors. That journalism is an important piece, a constant presence around coverage or debates about certain issues online, in conjunction with the actions by other actors. Let me give you another example. If you look at what is called intermedia agenda setting is a traditional line of research in media studies, and more recently there has been what is called intermedia, which is basically how agendas by the media affect what other media are covering, particularly in digital networks. And what it finds out is something similar to what I mentioned earlier, which is basically the idea that agenda setting mechanisms work differently than in the past because it's much more sort of network news sort of dynamics rather than from the media to the political elites or to the public. That sort of is a much more complicated dynamic. In which inevitably what this research shows that one of the key actors are, guess who? Journalism, at least some form of journalism that is a central actor together with other actors in producing information. And one issue here, talking about spillover effects, that has not been well studied, and correct me if I'm wrong, is actually the following: how journalistic content appear in digital content in ways that is almost invisible. Basically influencing trends, influencing the content of influencers, who basically sort of ride on content produced by news organizations to produce the content they produce. Commentary, memes, et cetera, et cetera. I understand that methodologically is a difficult issue to get at, but I think that it's important not to lose track that a lot of what is original content produced by news organizations, regardless of quality, et cetera, it is almost invisible. It's almost like the wallpaper. It's like background that we don't realize it is there on digital news. And finally, investigative reporting still packs a punch. Let me explain this. Investigative journalism may be limited in news ecologies globally due to a number of well-known reasons: cost, censorship, access to information. Yet it remains relevant. Exposures of wrongdoing, corruption, illegal action by powerful actors may not single-handedly bring about accountability or roll back illiberalism. But certain investigations recently were able to shake up politics by shattering official lies and false narratives, spark congressional and judicial investigations, prompt citizen mobilization, and triggering scandals. This is exactly what international partnerships of investigative journalists, as well as local investigative journalists, have done in recent years. In countries such as, and this is an incomplete sort of selection, countries such as Argentina, Brazil, El Salvador, Hungary, India, Poland, investigative journalism has revealed, let me list because it's a long list here: kickbacks, elite enrichment, censorship, wiretapping, vote buying, state capture, misuse of public funds, political surveillance, weaponization of judicial systems, crony capitalism, plans to overturn election results, digital militias, ties between government officials and mafias, and more. How do we know all this stuff? Well, we know this because of a relatively small number of investigative journalists working in partnership with local organizations or internationally. So what are the takeaways? And here, a few more slides, and then I will conclude. Altogether, these developments suggest that journalism in its many forms remain relevant and are essential. Journalism still matters, it's still relevant in spite of the so-called crisis of reach, resources, and reputation. I think it is premature to conclude that journalism and the news industry are irrelevant. Of course, they are not the towering institutions of public life that they once were, but they are hardly gone or became completely irrelevant. What we need to understand is something that Alfred Schutz, who is a sociologist, called different orders of reality in the early 1960s. He said, way before media fragmentation, political fragmentation, etc., he said the following: we live in different orders of reality. We live in finite provinces of meaning as experiences. In living in a province, we bestow the focus of reality, and in so doing, we relegate the other provinces to the background. Basically, he was making an argument that he was interested in relevance and in sort of what we call today the attention economy, is that there is no single attention economy, but it's sort of a fractured state. More on this I can explain. And the point that he was trying to make is that relevance is relational, right? It's about social relations that are established between institutions and individuals or among individuals. And I think this is a useful concept to think about understanding the social relevance or the political relevance of journalism as a connector, as a community builder, as a consciousness formation in everyday situations. And much of what journalism does probably is very difficult to measure, especially if you're looking for conventional metrics. How you measure legitimacy, power, structural embeddedness, moral significance. So, we need to understand the relevance of news across different attention regimes, rather than looking at the macro attention regime that is basically the typical way in which we tend to think about whether or not journalism is relevant. And we need to study different dimensions of journalism. One is a sense-making institution, how different groups use news in order to make sense of the world, how journalism helps to what Hannah Arendt called finding our bearings in an ever-changing world, and in the most literal sense, will not know where we are. We understand that a lot of people use non-journalistic sources to exactly do this, to find meaning, your sense of self, of what's happening in the world. But it's too soon to discount the importance of journalism on this matter. Second, we need to understand the structural position of news organization. And this is some of the research that I mentioned, that is looking at specific issues and the importance of the relevance of journalism within specific public issues, rather than just looking in general. Second, the continuous importance of journalism or certain news organizations in terms of symbolic capital and power, in terms of the power for storytelling, for identity formation. It's exactly what I tried to show in the case of niche news, right? Or in the spikes of attention around high impact events. Conclusion. So framing the current situation in binary terms, relevant or irrelevant, does not steer the analysis in a productive direction. The challenges of journalism amid a time of democratic backsliding cannot be described only as in terms of an existential threat or complete irrelevance. Yes, there is a fundamental discrepancy between journalism and dominant digital cultures. And it's not because news organizations are not interested or sufficiently nimble to adapt to the digital logic of digital culture. It's a deeper epistemological, sociological issues. The journalistic logic that shapes newsmaking is not well aligned with the communicative logic of digital content. Journalism is embedded in hierarchies of knowledge, expertise, original information, verification, accuracy, boundaries, context, and order. This in contrast with the dominant logic of the current order, the current digital order. This is why journalism is thrown into a constant battle for relevance in a world of information and communication that it no longer dominates and whose rules are very different. Journalism can only partially be retrofitted to stay relevant in the digital world, in spite of efforts. It's not for lack of trying. No matter how hard journalism tries to adjust, it swims upstream in a digital culture, right? Yet several developments, I hope that I discuss them, I show them, suggest that news and journalism in some contexts still matters, is still relevant. This doesn't invalidate legitimate anxieties about news industries or about the fate of quality journalism. But what I'm asking for here, the argument is to take a more nuanced approach to map out ways that journalism remains relevant for democracy and public life. This is part of the hope. Journalism relevance is different from the heyday of mass communication and news industry. So to respond to my students' query, and with this I will conclude, this is where I find my hope and moderate optimism. Let's not exaggerate optimism either. But I mean, this is what I find reasons for hope, for understanding the relevance of journalism. Maybe it's not an infinite amount of hope, but it's sufficient to believe that journalism, in certain conditions, in certain moments, is still relevant amid democratic erosion. Thank you very much.
So if everyone could just wait and raise their hand with questions, and I'll come to you as quickly as I can, just so that we can record your questions for the streaming video online. So who would like to pose the first question?
Do you think that social media helps promote the idea and the importance of journalism, or do you think it kind of hinders and takes away the attention from true reporting and true journalism?
Good question. I think that if we look at the decision made by big tech companies in the last years, clearly to demote, to deprioritize news content for very simple logical reasons, overturning sort of initial positions that try to sort of feature news content by legitimate sort of news organizations. And that has made it much more difficult for news organizations to actually get public from social media. That was deliberate, and the decision was made by Meta, 21, 22? So since then, it has been very difficult, and that's why it explains that increasingly traffic until the eruption of generative AI primarily depended on Google search. So you will be lucky, I will say, if you find much original news content on social media these days, or certain content depending on the politics of the platform and the algorithm. No matter how hard you try to tailor the content to of the news feed to your interests. So and you prioritize content on the public issues that is not produced by news organizations, but is produced by influencers and sort of those kinds of sources. That is done by design because it's according to their data, sort of what really drives engagement is more likely to drive up engagement, which is the word, sort of the magic word that they use in order to determine success. So yes, I mean, that is interesting enough because news organizations for a while adapted to sort of social media platforms and affordances and mimic the content and of TikTok news or Instagram news, and actually with increasingly with very sort of limited results just because of the logic of the algorithm response to the vision by this company. So.
Thank you for your comments tonight. It's hard not to think of journalism in the U.S. in the era of Trump, and I'd just be curious on your comments about what the media has done well, especially here in the second Trump administration, and maybe what the media isn't doing well as it relates to maintaining relevance or keeping people from avoiding media, et cetera.
Great question. So maybe I'll give you a little context. I thought I had the slide in this deck, but I don't. About 12 kind of actions, big actions that the administration has done in order to undermine, go after journalism. So it has used every tactic in the playbook, as I mentioned very quickly earlier, legal, economic, violence, rhetoric. I mean, everything is just, for those who have studied populism and media for a while, is exactly, sort of every single rule there. I think that certain news organizations have tried to do a best job they can within, the constraints and the sort of editorial politics. My sense is that there are sort of always exceptions that try to do, a decent job trying to hold the administration accountable. But that kind of work depends on other conditions. It cannot be done only by journalism if we know what happens in other democracies in a very similar state, let's say, a state of ascent of illiberalism. The journalism doesn't do the work itself. It needs members of the political elite. It needs civil society. It needs government agencies. So it's not just journalists working on their own to actually document how power works, or how power works in a way to undermine checks and balances and accountability. So depending where you look, and that's what I was saying earlier, there's probably great journalism that probably doesn't meet the audience it deserves because it reach certain publics and not other publics. And that probably is what I find that needs to be done. What do I mean by that? Particularly journalism, especially in these days, is concerned primarily with how do you do the job with the best you can, given the resources and probably some of the expectations and the pressures that exist. But it's also important to understand what publics need to be reached with this, right? And as long as you reach the public that already is convinced that, abusive forms of power are happening, and probably you know this, maybe you'll know because of journalism, at least to some extent, how do you reach other publics? And that is more of a communication exercise, more of a communication challenge rather than a journalistic challenge. Because journalism basically says, this is what our audience that we know, our readers, our viewers, look for and all that. So it all depends what news organizations we're talking about here, and the kind of work that they could do or should do to shed light into a number of issues that I assume many of us have been watching and discussing for the last, 14, 15 months. So that is, to me, the main challenge. In addition to the clearly journalistic challenges, it is a question of relevance, how you make this content relevant to audiences who probably might be receptive, may be interested, but they are not, watching or being exposed to certain important stories, right? So those are my thoughts without talking about individual stories or coverage, et cetera. But I mean, overall picture, I think those are my thoughts on these issues. You can find lots of critical coverage of the current administration, specifically focused on issues, let's say migration or the economy, et cetera. I mean, if you know where to find it, you will find it. We can discuss how excellent or not the quality is, but in some ways you can find critical voices, critical reporting, fact-based. The question is whether or not it is sufficient to attract, who is attracted, who's interested in those kinds of stories. So.
Thank you. Fascinating. What is the role of universities and schools of journalism and media in helping to continue the relevancy of journalism? And how do you balance what you teach today with the assault on education and media?
Well, I think, you just said it. What is it about? It's having conversations and, asking students to engage with the question of why journalism matters and why freedom of expression matters. Why censorship is bad. How censorship functions. What are the multiple drivers of censorship? What are the consequences of censorship? How self-censorship works. Why academic freedom matters. Those are the issues, that, sort of to be discussed. And presented with very sort of real world cases for students. I teach a class in international journalism where we cover, global risk and global problems and how journalism covers or fails to cover them, from climate to migration, humanitarian crisis, and all that. So the question I always ask, how you cover this in situations of censorship or persecution of journalists. So for students to learn about the challenge of that. The most dangerous beat around the world is environmental journalism, right? Consistently. Why? Because of the conditions in which they work and where they work. In some ways, they're much more vulnerable to all kinds of actors, state actors, non-state actors, militias, big, powerful industrial interests who don't like journalists sort of scrutinizing what they do. So that's I think, that's the way that I approach it in both classes that I teach. That's the question. I grew up in a situation, under dictatorship in Argentina. And then the question is, how censorship works. It is very interesting because censorship works not in ways that there is some kind of, let's say, blue book in which, this is what you are told, it works, it doesn't work. Journalists, there was no such a book in most countries in South America during military dictatorships. There was not an official book where the regime tells you, this is what you cover, your cover. No, it was much more insidious because it's trying to help you, the reporter, the publishers, to self-censor, to figure out whether or not you can go ahead with certain stories. There's a recent piece by Frontline on El Faro, which is probably the premier investigative medium in El Salvador. They have to go into exile, etc. And it basically is a fascinating view at how actually they try to sort of push the boundaries of what kind of report and not report, because they don't know when sort of you can push with certain stories, right? So unfortunately, we're in a situation in which this is not just abstract, it's not history, it's not what happened somewhere else. Sort of these, wicked sort of politics of censorship. And that's something to, engage with students. You can look at examples around the world. You're looking at how it might happen or is happening here.
Hi. Do you think that traditional journalism underestimated not only the different ways that people were going to get their news, but how willing people are to accept things as facts that are blatantly untrue that they're hearing from alternative sources? Do you think they underestimated how powerful that would be and have to adjust to deal with that?
I think journalism has been for the last, for sure, 20 years, if not probably a bit longer than that, in a reactive mode. I always say that, journalism, quote unquote, doesn't have a future because it doesn't control it. Journalism in some forms will exist, but it doesn't control the dynamics of what is rapidly changing. It doesn't control the economics, it doesn't control the technology, it doesn't control the politics. And we have plenty of examples now, unfortunately, of, and I don't think that it underestimated journalism believed that it would still matter. That's why journalism in the 90s started giving content for free. Right? Which in retrospect was, let's say, a questionable decision, to put it mildly. Right? They spent a lot of money producing original content that they gave for free. Why? Because they thought as in marketing terms. I give you some for free and then you will subscribe and, 2 for 1 kind of thing. And then you come back to us and ask for more and you pay for it. No. So, and I think that it was a series, and I mean, now we connect the dots and we know, some of the mistakes along the way, which actually were global mistakes. It was not unique to the US news industry, that it had a very similar approach. But journalism kept sort of convinced that eventually, it will find its audience. And yes, there's some audience, that subscribe to news, are willing to pay for news, but that's not the global model. That applies to a very few global news organizations that people believe that, yes, I want to support and subscribe and pay X amount of money, and then subscriber revenues become an important part of the overall business model. But it's not, the norm across a wide range of news organizations, large, medium, and small, that need to figure out other funding models. Your question also reminds me of another thing that we, journalism studies and media scholars, have debated, which was fact-checking. Confronted with sort of the challenges of this and misinformation, more clearly 2016 when the issue became, the word of the year, disinformation, etc. They believe that fact-checking will be an answer to disinformation. That a journalistic value will have some answers to this problem. And logically, I mean, that's what journalists do. And then sort of ingenious ways to cover lies. They created sort of the sandwich truth. First you report the truth, then report the lie, and then the truth again, just in case people forgot. I mean, all kinds of, I would say, creative storytelling to basically do that. And what we know, that disinformation is not that misinformation may be about people having the wrong facts or people not knowing. Disinformation is something different. It's much more convoluted. It's mixed up with dynamics about identity and authority and, it's deep, more sociological and political questions rather than, oops, people sort of didn't check the facts kind of thing. And I'm saying this because in some ways it sort of became something that deserved attention, and it got a lot of funding, initiatives inside and outside journalism to actually do this, and actually not understanding the complexity of the problem, right? And that to me was another sort of decision that I think we can say news organizations had sort of, believed that what they do was going to be a legitimate answer, but it became much more complex, and the actual evidence sort of literature on that is much more mixed. The facts do make a difference in certain conditions, not necessarily when people are scrolling and spending 4 seconds with each reel in their smartphones, right? So that is another thing, meaning saying the problem is much more complex than people's access, availability, retrievability of, trust. I mean, the question is, whether or not the source of facts is actually trustworthy or not. I could go on, but I will stop here. Sorry.
Hi, thank you very much. The younger generation is no longer reading newspapers, and television gives information in sound bites. Smartphones gives information in sound bites. Where is in-depth journalism going to go in the future?
Question. I think that there will always be an audience, but probably will be a smaller audience, yet it might be a relevant audience, right? The question how that is going to be funded, and so far it seems to be that, let me tell you what the problem is, that audience belongs to a certain sort of socioeconomic background, and research actually shows that increasingly people who pay and who follow certain forms of quality journalism are the people who, from certain educational background, socio-demographic background, race. So the challenge here is how you expand the relevance to sort of different audiences, right? That not necessarily are interested in, let's say, in-depth journalism or long-form journalism or quality. I mean, there are different ways in which we can call, I think, what we have in mind when we talk about this. That to me, it is a challenge on par with all the other challenges that we have discussed. And particularly when I know in the countries that I know slightly better, that kind of journalism not necessarily, has a clear funding model. When it did, it was with support from philanthropic organizations or aid, at least the cases in Central and South America that I know better to support that kind of journalism. And that model that sort of has, suffered significant impact for decisions that were made in this country last year that took away funding, that it was clearly, at the sort of the backbone for many forms of journalism that do what you just mentioned. So that is sort of part of this, bad storm of events. So.
Just a quick point, and then your comment on it. When I studied journalism way back in the 60s, it was pointed out that accuracy was essential to a newspaper keeping its audience. Well, in the wake of the October 6th, 2023 incident in Israel, subsequent stories were run, not all of them accurate. One in particular appeared in the New York Times. The headline was, as I recall, Israeli rocket strikes hospital, killing hundreds, Palestinians say.
Yep.
Subsequent investigation of that story revealed, first of all, the picture accompanying it was a destroyed building, not the hospital at all.
Secondly, the journalist running the story had gotten the information from Hamas.
Right.
But that would be unacceptable, he knew, so he inserted the word Palestinian.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, investigation showed that it was a Hamas rocket that had gone astray.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would do the New York Times and other journalistic publications quite a bit of good in the public eye, because these things don't go unnoticed if they strove for more accuracy in their reporting today, as they did in the past.
So, yeah, I mean, I believe that at some point the New York Times sort of publicly sort of recognized the situation and the error made in that case. I believe so. If I'm not mistaken, I will search for it. Whether or not that is indicative of major failures in verification or checking information, it is questionable. Is it that a situation of, what are the factors there? They rushed with the story way before they, had to document and check everything else. Probably it's not clear what led them to do that. Is that typical of their coverage of the conflict and the war? I don't know. I mean, so I understand sort of the what happened there. What was the failure there in that story? But probably after the story, I'm just hypothesizing, they started sort of acknowledging what was the source of the information that they were publishing, or trying to publish, sort of the, let's say, two views on these sort of very difficult issues, especially with, for the most part, especially early on, they didn't have access to the zone, so therefore they had to rely on a different way a much more limited way of verifying, confirming information. Not about justifying, it's understanding why they published something that eventually I think they retracted, or they sort of disclosed that that was mistaken. I don't know if that talks about a major sort of systematic crisis in the systems of verification by the paper of record, or mainstream news organizations in this country. So that's my reaction to that comment. How systemic it is of the coverage of the conflict and the war for the last almost 3 years, right? I don't know, and I don't know if the study has been done yet. But thank you for your question.
I'd be interested in your thoughts on Substack. And there have been a couple online news magazines with longer form writing, some reporting, some what you call journalism. And what seems notable to me is that Substack now offers free subscription, but people will pay and support writers they like. And there are some rather well-known, important journalists and reporters on this.
So I see the point. I think that would ask the question of several questions there. What are the demographics of people who read Substack, right? Second, whether or not how people build an audience in Substack. We know the better-known cases of people, well-known names who migrated from mainstream journalism to Substack because they carried it, an audience and quote unquote a business model way of funding and making money out of that. But to what extent it translates to across the unknown thousands of people who try to build an audience in Substack and reach different audiences, probably with sort of uncertain results, or probably not the results of the Paul Krugmans of the world. So same thing goes with podcasts, probably, in terms of these interests. And podcasts is still, one of a few of the Reuters data actually shows that it's a very small percentage, single digits, low single digits of people who regularly say, I get news from podcasts. So what I'm putting them all together because let's find what the relevance is within the broader context of news flows and the way that people encounter news or follow news. Recognizing the significance in terms of who's reached, but without sort of exaggerating what relevance has in the broader news information landscape. I'm asking my colleagues here whether or not you know a good study about these kind of issues related to Substack or to podcasts. Well, to be continued probably, but I mean I cannot remember right now that the few studies that I know about podcasts talk about exactly the same podcasters out of thousands of people who started their podcast. So maybe that is something that is, suggested there here. So.
Is there one last question from the group, or else I might jump in and take it? One last one? Okay.
Yeah, I was really interested. Thank you for that talk. It was very thought-provoking, and you raised a lot of important issues. And I think even the Substack question kind of speaks to what you were saying about the rise of sort of niche journalism and different audiences. But I'm wondering, as you're speaking, as I'm listening to your discussion of different funding models, I'd like to hear your take on sort of the macro level economic shifts that are happening. For example, the recent huge merger of Nexstar and Tegna. $2.6 billion merger approved by the Trump administration. These kinds of things that are, and then the defunding of PBS and NPR.
Those are part of the 12 points that I have in the slide about all these multiple tactics to achieve a very similar goal. Defunding public media, giving the okay to these big mega mergers. It's not the first time, of course, but, most of these are not actually the first time in this country that these things are happening, but they're happening so fast and simultaneously. That's what I think that is pretty remarkable, right? The deployment of all these tactics.
Yeah, but I was just saying that, like public broadcasting, at least in this country, was a sort of counter to corporatized private media that's increasingly becoming political propaganda, really. And so, yeah, I mean.
Well, and it's an all cause of certain, group in this country that have advocated against public media since at least since 1967, if not earlier than that. So before corporate, public broadcasting. So the Corporation of Public Broadcasting, and that has been done in a very short amount of time, and it's not only public media, of course. So I mean, how do you explain that? Media clientelism 101 is pretty basic. That's what it's all about. Right, that we have seen in country after country around the world, what I briefly mentioned earlier. What is remarkable is the size of these mergers and the companies. Here we're talking about billions of dollars, and I think that clearly there is a question here of both corporate as well as economic and political convenience here. It's not just a question of favoring friendly business interests, let's say, or close friends. It's just about the political implications of this, and that's why, the CBS thing, and all the examples basically speak about something more than just, allowing big companies to become bigger. It's about very clear political expectations as a result of those mergers, if not before that. That is, what is very, and it's clearly is happening as we see it, right? Those are my thoughts. We can get deeper into that, but I think that that's the common thread here, right? A multiple sort of assault from various fronts on journalism, and then again, that's how censorship actually works. Right.
I see those as threats to journalism.
Right, exactly right. Right. Sort of making, shrinking the spaces where journalism can do, make a journalistic call on what stories to cover. without being concerned, about outside pressures or internal pressures, right?
All right, fantastic. If we could all take a moment and put our hands together and thank Sylvia for what's really been a fantastic program and Q&A period. We hope to see you all next Thursday, April 16th, for the Public Library at 6 p.m. right here for worker resilience from South Africa's mines to Iowa's farms, fields, and meatpacking plants.